So in this recording, we're going to talk about some of the very basic trig identities. And the first one we're going to talk about is the quotient identities, and those are concerning the tangent and the cotangent. So the first thing I've done is I've taken this angle and I've marked it in standard position, and we're just going to use, for right now, we're going to use pi over 3 radians, which is the same as 60 degrees. And I'm going to imagine that we drop a vertical line down here as well, and I'm just going to shorten up the radius right over here. Okay, so if I know that this is here is going to be theta, and that's going to be about 60 degrees, this is going to be 1, this here is going to be root 3 over 2, and then the cosine over here is going to be 1/2. So remember, according to our trig ratios, the cosine is what always gives us the x value, so this is the cosine, and this side here is going to be equal to the cosine of theta. And this here always comes from the sine, which means that this side here is going to equal the sine of theta. That means that the tangent, which is the opposite over the adjacent, the tangent of theta is always going to equal the sine of theta divided by cosine of theta. Okay? And likewise, the cotangent, which is just the reciprocal, the cotangent of theta, is simply going to equal the cosine of theta divided by the sine of theta. So those are our quotient identities, and they're called quotient identities for the obvious reason that they're being divided. Next, we have our Pythagorean identities. In order to find all 3 Pythagorean identities, we're going to use some of this quotient stuff here. So you may remember from much earlier in the year Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, that's all we have right here is we have ourselves a right triangle with a hypotenuse of 1. This side here is equal to the cosine of theta. This side here is equal to the sine of theta. And so if I do the sine squared of theta plus the cosine squared of theta, it should equal the hypotenuse squared, which is just 1. So that's my first Pythagorean identity. I know that if I square the sine of theta and I square the cosine of theta, that's going to equal the hypotenuse squared, which is just 1. So that's my first Pythagorean identity. That's the one that's the most common. Sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta equals 1. So I'm going to leave that one there, and I'm going to just clone it real quick and bring it over here because this is going to help us find our next Pythagorean identity. So what would happen if we took this identity and we divided everything here by the sine squared of theta? Divided every term by the sine squared theta. Well, that would simply give us, this is going to be 1, sine squared divided by sine squared is going to be 1, plus, and then cosine over sine. We've seen that before. That was this right here. The only difference is these ones are squared. So according to our exponent rules, if we square the top and square the bottom, it's the same as squaring the entire fraction. So this is really going to be the cosine over the sine is equal to the cotangent. So the cosine squared over the sine squared is equal to the cotangent squared of theta. And that's going to equal 1 over the sine squared. Well, 1 over the sine is the cosecant. And so 1 over sine squared would be equal to the cosecant. Oops, screw that up. Let me grab the eraser. That would be equal to 1 over, nope, that's a lie too. That would be equal to the cosecant squared of theta. So that's going to be our second identity here. Let me just grab this whole thing and bring it right over here. So we have 2 of our 3 Pythagorean identities. Our third option now is to, instead of dividing by the sine, we're going to divide everything here by the cosine. So we'll divide this by the cosine squared theta, divide this by cosine squared theta, and divide this by cosine squared theta. And so what that's going to give us, now we have sine squared over cosine squared. Well, remember that tangent was sine over cosine. So tangent squared would be sine squared over cosine squared. So this is going to be the tangent squared theta. Cosine squared divided by cosine squared is just going to be 1. And 1 over the cosine squared, well, that's just going to equal the secant squared of theta. So there we go. This is our third Pythagorean identity, which we'll slide right over here. And these are all going to be true, and we just proved it by using this one here, which was from the Pythagorean theorem. And then once we had this, remember we divided by the sine squared to find this one. And then we went back to this and divided by the cosine squared to find this one. I hope this helps solve some of your trig identity questions in the future. Thanks for watching.